No BS here, just the facts.
And now we present to you America's quintessential iconoclastic anomaly.
Wow.
In talk radio, your host, Joe Cristiano.
Welcome, everyone, to Liberty Talk Radio, America's libertarian voice, broadcasting from our studio in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to around the world. I'm your host, Joe Cristiano, and this is your antidote to popular talk radio. Folks, it's time for us to take back control of our government now before this bureaucratic, oversized, and self-serving federal government starves us of our property, our freedom, our rights, and our liberty. But to do this, we must shed conventional thinking regarding our political structure. We need to be revolutionaries in thought, dissidents in action. Only after we recognize what our government is doing to our freedom and our Constitution will we start taking it back, and this program is just about that. Today, folks, our guest is Mr. Peter Van Buren. He's a 24-year veteran of the U.S. Department of State. We will be discussing his book today, which I had just finished reading, Hooper's War, a novel of World War II. He is also an author of several other books. This book centers around a moral injury, as a result of war. And as a result of reading this book, it just conjured up so many questions in my own mind, ones that I've never asked myself before, and some conclusions that I've come to that I've never come to before. I do recommend you read this book. It is a novel, but it'll make you think. All right, Peter, thank you very much for joining us here on Liberty Talk Radio.
Joe, a great pleasure to be with you here.
Yeah. Oh, I'd like to mention you can call in during our live broadcast if you dial 646-652-4620. That's 646-652-4620. You can either listen in, or if you want to join the conversation and make a comment, press the one button so we know that you want to join us. Okay. I'm sorry. All right. Well, welcome to Liberty Talk Radio. It's a real pleasure to have it, an honor to have you here. I thoroughly enjoyed your book, but I have to ask this question right up front. What possessed you to write this book?
I spent a year in Iraq embedded with the U.S. military as part of my State Department service. And my job was to help with the reconstruction efforts there. And I did this under two presidents, under President Obama and before President Bush. I was apolitical. I didn't really think too much of either president or too little of either president. My job was to serve what I thought were the interests of the United States. What I found instead in Iraq was extraordinary waste and fraud and mismanagement, such that we laid the groundwork for the present struggle there with ISIS. And I wrote a book about that called We Meant Well, right. That I thought purged this sense of unease that I brought home with me. It turned out that I was wrong. I started talking to more and more people who had been in Iraq with me, civilians and soldiers, and from there started to meet more and more people whose military service left them with something wrong inside, a feeling of unsettledness, a feeling that they had contributed to something that was very, very wrong, something that they had either actively helped make wrong or passively accepted as wrong. And I continued to struggle with this idea until finally I was introduced to the concept of moral injury. And the idea is very simple. If we as complex human beings have a sense of right and wrong, that sense of right and wrong can be tested and can be broken. And that is indeed what happened. And I needed to write about that and bring this story to people's attention. And that was with the evolution of Hooper's War. It got deeper and deeper the more I went down the rabbit hole. I started talking to, through a happen chance, meeting Japanese civilians who survived World War II, and learned from them that many of them came out of that conflict with this sense that they had either witnessed wrongdoing and passively accepted it or participated in wrongdoing. And I realized moral injury was not unique to combatants. It was not unique to any particular war. And I put that all together in a book in what is hopefully a readable form. You mentioned it's a novel, and it is largely a fictional story made up of absolutely all true facts, some torn from my own experience, some based on interviews with elderly Japanese civilians, some based on interviews with 25-year-old American men and women who are fresh off the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah. I'm really afraid I'm going to broadened the subject so wide that we'll never get through it. But I have so many questions. What this prompted me to do is to examine for myself some of the definitions of the titles that we give to the things that we do. And if I go too far off stream, please correct me and say, let's get back here, and I won't be, upset at that. But because this book impacted me more than most books that I've ever read. And that's why I encourage people to read it. Maybe they will understand better what I'm about to say or ask of you. We have a Department of Defense. Well, to me, defense is defending oneself, not going overseas, seeking out people that they suspect may cause injury to the United States and killing them, or in whatever they do to them, torturing them or putting them in prison, or even worse, giving coordinates to someone thousands of miles away and say, here are your coordinates, and then have a drone bomb an area and not maybe kill them, but also kill innocent men, women, and children and grandparents in that neighborhood. Today, defense is when we suspect someone may not adhere to what we are doing, then we are justified in doing away with them. I'm having so much trouble with this, you have no idea. I mean, I've never stumbled so much in a conversation in my life. And for example, after reading your book, the first question I asked myself, after knowing something about World War II, it made me think, did we ever have to go to war with Japan? That was after Midway. Was there any need to go to war at all with Japan? Japan was finished as it was. Their concern was mostly China and Russia and everyone else, and also Korea. I mean, they had no fuel. The Dutch cut them off. Everyone cut them off. And I wonder if we are looking reasons to go to war and benefiting a small group of elites in America at the expense of everyone else, not only in America, but worldwide. And I apologize for the diatribe.
No, I think you've touched on the core issues that I'm exploring in this book. And I think the first one is the setting, which is World War II Japan, a lightly fictionalized version of World War II, because I needed to bring my American character, my Japanese soldier character,
right,
and my Japanese female civilian character together, and that required a little bit of a writer's hocus pocus, if you will. But I wanted to talk about the issues of war and morality and expediency in as broadly generic a sense as I could. And to do that, I had to pull us out of modern wars. As soon as we talk about, as you mentioned there, drone killings and remote control killings, and the question of area bombings to hope to kill one bad guy, or fighting for oil, or things like the themes of our modern wars, every listener has a very firm opinion about what's right and wrong in those situations. And I wanted to get past that. And World War II seemed far enough in the past, right, that it was fresher territory, but it was not as unfamiliar as me having to explain sort of, well, the orcs are the bad guys and the elves are the good guys. So World War II seemed kind of a particular sweet spot. And what I do in the book is I place these three characters in a continuing series of situations where they face a moral choice. They face a decision between expediency and morality that oftentimes there is no clear answer. If there were a clear answer, it'd be a shorter book, this would be a shorter program, and one of us, you or I, would be running this country. But put them in these situations, put the reader in that situation, and say, whatever you do decide, you're going to live with that in your soul for the next 70 to 80 years.
Right.
And you're going to have seconds to decide, oops, time's up. Pull the trigger or step away. And in our modern world, we have more of a luxury to look back on these things and say, well, we're not all 18-year-old soldiers in the field. It's very difficult to say in that circumstance what's right or wrong. But however, when you're the President of the United States and you're forced and you're placed in a situation to say that torture is right or wrong, you're not an 18-year-old kid who's facing a ticking time bomb who may take a life in error. And it may not be his fault, though it will eventually be his responsibility. But when you're the President of the United States and you're setting policy, you are removed from that battlefield. You have more responsibility. You have more culpability. You are the moral actor. And when the President fails to exercise that moral authority on behalf of the United States, that scales this concept of moral injury up from the individual soldier to us as a nation, to all of us. Right. And those are the kinds of questions that I'm demanding the reader face when he or she reads this book, even though it, on surface, appears to be a good story with some good battle scenes, even a little romance tucked into the middle. Yeah. But the bigger questions lurk there just below the surface.
Yeah, and you know, I read the book Day of Deceit, which calls into question whether or not we knew calls into question that we, in fact, knew that the Japanese had planned to bomb Pearl Harbor or to bomb one of our bases in the Pacific, and yet our sailors were playing badminton, you know, when the planes came over. So obviously the word didn't get down. But you would think that it was intentional at that point that the Japanese did win and did incurred much injury and damage to Pearl Harbor to justify and from I guess a populist point of view, extending the war to the Far East. Although, I mean, after Midway and we bombed. Sunk the only 4 aircraft carriers that they had, and Japan had no more fuel. I mean, they were a dead duck, but yet we still had to go there and kill. And it just bothers me why we're such a warfare state. And I like to tie that in just to a day or two when our president went to Saudi Arabia and committed billions of dollars worth of sales of arms to Saudi Arabia, one of the most egregious states in the world. You know, it seems that if it has to do with war, we're all in. And the United States was not supposed to be that country. You know, we were blessed by the Pacific Pond and the Atlantic Pond, and we didn't have to screw with all these other countries and all their quirks and their wars and their differences. We could have been left alone, and we can trade with everyone and be the good guys, but we go out of our way to involve ourselves where we shouldn't be at all. I'm sorry for the long diatribe. I'm really upset after reading this book. I'm sorry.
Because what you're doing is, Joe, is you're laying out the larger story that is behind the smaller story that I'm telling in Hooper's War. Because each of these large events that you're referring to, whether in policy or specific conflicts, ends up being placed on the shoulders of young men and women who carry the suffering and the pain with them. It is a criminal act of our government that 20 veterans a day commit suicide.
That's right, yeah.
In the United States. 20 a day. Statistically, while we're here doing this interview, there's a reasonable chance that a veteran is taking his or her own life. Half of those veterans are over the age of 50, which suggests strongly that this is not a post-9/11 issue. This is not related to the circumstances of the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan, where the enemy is more ambiguous, perhaps, than, say, in World War II. This is suggesting that there is something very wrong with the policy of the American government, that we are creating generations of sufferers, people who walk around our society carrying with them the amount of pain it must take to drive someone to take their own life after service to their country. If there were 20 people out of the veterans group dying every day of something similar, of a different type of disease,
Right.
this would be a criminal act. This would be something that would be front page news, and we would be dealing with it as a public health crisis.
Right.
Instead, here in the United States, we pervert, the government essentially shrugs its shoulders. I have to say that there has been a small bit of progress. The Veterans Administration does now recognize moral injury as a treatable illness, does include it on the list of things that they will provide care for. It was a struggle for many people, the same way as in a decade ago, PTSD was kind of shrugged off by many people. Oh, you're just a yellow belly, or you're scared. Have a drink, take some time off, you'll be okay. It's all in your head. Well, I think we understand now that PTSD is not only very real, but can in fact be measured with tests such as MRIs. The same thing with this concept of moral injury. The soul is not that big of a place. When you place people into positions, especially young people with limited world experience, many times overseas for the very first time, certainly in almost every case for the very first time with the power to take lives, and the responsibility to protect each other's lives. When you put that kind of weight on someone and say, you don't know what's going to happen, and there's not really a clear right and wrong all the time, so good luck with all that, and afterwards we'll buy you drinks at Applebee's.
Right.
You are essentially throwing these young people away. You're discarding them. You're hoping they come back okay, and you're not particularly concerned when they don't. And one of the things in Hooper's War, my book that I do, as you know, is I alternate the narrator between 18-year-old Hooper, who is experiencing the shock of these events, and 85-year-old Hooper, who is looking back on a life of having lived with the decisions he made as a young man, and reflecting on the other veterans that he's known, the other experiences that he's had. And that allows the reader, no matter what perspective he or she is coming from, whether a young person perhaps considering military service, a middle-aged person who's had his or her own experiences, or an older person who's looking back at service or service of loved ones. I'm trying to reach all of those ages and say, you may know about this part of the experience, but you may not know about that part of the experience. It's a book I couldn't have written when I was 24 years old. And it's a book that I had to write now that I'm at this age, heading towards 60, that I had to write at this age, because I have the perspective of looking back on these events, and for the situations that I haven't yet had enough life experience, I've benefited from talking to a number of people who served in World War II on both the American side and the Japanese side. I lived in Japan. I speak Japanese, and so it became the Japanese side. I suspect if I had fallen in love in Germany, I would speak German and it would be featured there, but these things do happen. And that place where you can pull in from your own experience and pull in from others' experience is the intersection between art and nonfiction. And that's what I'm really trying to do here, is to reach into my soul and to reach into the reader's guts and pull them both out and say, there's something going on here. Your brothers and sisters are dying in great numbers, and that's not right.
Yeah.
We need to think about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I wasn't on the opposite side of the room about the content, about the intent of this book, but in reading it, it just amplified it all to me. I start thinking about terms. When the president says repeats the Pledge of Allegiance, I say, blasphemy. How dare you say that? I mean, he shouldn't be allowed to say that because he violates everything. He violates all our elected officers, violate our Constitution. And when I hear the term, thank you. When you meet someone who's served in the armed forces, they say thank you for your service, and I understand what they're saying, and they mean well. Don't get me wrong. I'm not casting dispersions on the person who served. Don't get me wrong. I'm on their side, but you have to ask yourself, what service to whom? And no one's asking the question. It seems that we're a nation of zombies. We just want to be told what to think. And anything beyond that is just too painful or too difficult. We won't do it. We just accept what we hear.
I've never run into a soldier that I served with, and I spent the year embedded with the military in Iraq. I was not in the green zone. I was out in the field. I was mortared 72 times. It always happened at night, so I kept hash marks on the wall next to my bed. We were shot at. We saw the aftermath of car bombs, and tragically, the units that I was with, the only fatalities in the year were self-inflicted. 2 soldiers took their own lives while we were in Iraq. And I can't identify a man or a woman that I was with who's willing to talk frankly, who wants to be thanked by strangers for his or her service. Nobody turns down an upgrade on the airline. Nobody says no thank you to a drink. But I think everyone wants to say, my service, what do you know about my service?
Right, yeah. Yeah.
And to demand from the public not just casual thanks in line at Walmart, but instead proper care when they've come home. Care at the VA, care at private institutions, care where the care needs to be delivered. Decisions that the people who are sick receive medical assistance. For example, it's controversial, but unfortunately, people who have received less than honorable discharges are not eligible for psychological care in emergency situations through the VA. And that is changing. Congress is looking at that right now and examining the question of at what point do we want to stop punishing our people and say that we want to take care of each other because we're all Americans, and that we've all answered the call honestly, even if the country has betrayed us in that process. We ourselves have tried to do the right thing. And thanks for the upgrade, thanks for the free drinks, but damn it, let us have the medications that we need. Let us see the doctors that we need. Right. Provide us the jobs that we want to have. It's terrific that there's plenty of races where people in wheelchairs and those who have lost limbs can compete. But what we really want is a place to go to work, to earn a living, to take care of our families, to respect the country that we tried to serve in a concrete way, not in a way that just looks good on a bumper sticker.
Yeah. Now, I cannot believe, I don't think I'm that naive to think that it's just you and I that recognize this, but the government officials recognize this. They know this. They know it probably better than we do. They understand this. They live with this, but yet they persist on continuing this same mantra of war, of supplying, of killing people. Basically, it's not war when men, women, and children. Look at the situation in Yemen. Saudi Arabia is just, the place looks like, London after, the German Blitz. And yet we're supplying Saudi Arabia with more weapons. Are we insane? But the people in Washington must know this, so they can't be good people. They've got to be selfish. I don't give a damn how much you suffer as long as I make money out of the deal type of person. I cannot help but think that that's the way they think. They can't be that stupid not to know what you and I are talking about. I'm sure they hear this all the time.
There's an old Chinese saying that says, you need to know who feeds the dog before you pet it. And the point being that the dog is loyal to the person who feeds him. And that's the same thing with our politicians. There's much of the liberal media has made a big fuss about the fact that Trump sold all these weapons to the Saudis recently, and it's a terrible thing. But the media seems to forget that before him, Barack Obama sold weapons to the Saudis. Before him, George Bush sold weapons to the Saudis, and so forth all the way back. It's the same dog being fed by the same people. Sure, Trump is not Obama, and Obama is not Bush, and all those types of things. But when you get down to the core issues of maintaining an endless cycle of war, of misusing the brave men and women who volunteer for our military, of expending our tax money overseas. When I was in Iraq, we were building schools and roads and bridges for the Iraqis. And every day it was an unanswerable question. Why were we not building schools and roads and bridges with that same money in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the Ohio where I grew up, in the city of New York where I live now? Why are we doing these things overseas, and why are we not doing them here at home? Let's take every one of our soldiers who's involved in a needless war overseas, bring them home, and put them to work right here in the United States, fixing things, building things, creating things, opening up jobs, opening up our infrastructure, making America a better place. I'd like to see tax money used that way. I'd like to see American lives used that way. I'd like to see us begin the process of redemption for moral injury by giving people the chance to come home and help their country and dedicate their patriotism to our nation rather than to killing people who have no quarrel with us.
Well, the conclusion that you have to come to is that the people in office are corrupt beyond your own comprehension. I mean, a normal person could not conceive of how corrupt these people are, and they run for office. Got a 2-year term for a congressman. They're in there for 38 years. They've got. How corrupt are these? How do they sleep at night? I mean, they know that what they're doing. They're not oblivious to this. What kind of people are they? I mean, if I did 1,000th of what they did, I couldn't live with myself.
I wish I knew the answer to that, because I hope that once they get to hell, it's a very, very hot part of hell where they set up residence. It is stunning to look at the net worth of people when they first start working in elected office and when they walk out of elected office. There's very, very few who come out of elected office poorer than when they went in, and there's very few that don't leave elected office wealthy. And the amount of money that is spent by the arms industry lobbying for war, the drug industry lobbying for healthcare policy, and it's all done in plain sight. You know, we joke about, well, these third world. I've lived as part of my State Department career in third world countries where that are considered corrupt, where if you need to get something done, something as simple sometimes as making sure a letter doesn't get lost at the post office, a little bribe a little money needs to change hands. And people talk about, the corruption in those countries. Good thing it's not like that here in the United States. And of course, the answer is you think too small. Sure. You don't necessarily have to bribe the postal carrier. But the idea of Trump being the first president to be making a profit in office makes me laugh. It absolutely challenges sanity to imagine.
I'm not bashing Trump. I'm bashing the entire system and the way it's operated for the past 50 years or 75 years. I think the last decent president we had was Calvin Coolidge. He said very few words, and he cut the expenditures of government by 50% during the worst depression that is never talked about, by the way. Never talked about. The depression when he was in office was much worse than 29, but it lasted such a short period of time because he basically eliminated all the expenses of government. He eliminated all the regulations, and he said, business people know business better than I do. He was a man of very few words. In fact, there's a story about a woman saying, I bet I can make you say 3 words. And his response was, you lose. And my favorite president, but he did exactly what the Constitution. He says, I'm a servant to the people. I'm not going to spend any money. I'm going to save them money and make the American people use the money as they see fit. He was the last president that did that. And that was 1917 or whatever it was. And today we have the exact reverse. I am getting so bad these days. I tell you, I really wonder about myself. Good thing I'm young. I'm only 74, so I got a long way to go. And after reading this book, I was watching the dumb news, and they were talking about Trump going to Saudi Arabia. The first thing I thought of, I didn't authorize that. I paid. He is the servant of the people, right? He went to Saudi Arabia with my money. Never asked me permission. Says, may I use some of your money to go to Saudi Arabia? Never asked me the question. And then he went there, and he made an agreement to sell them arms, and at the same time, he wants to do something about ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban, and all these other groups, Well, sell the Saudis arms and you'll have more war. I mean, he's creating these wars and not resolving them. And he can only resolve them, in my opinion, if he closed all the bases around the world, brought everyone home, did not interfere with any country, and allowed the citizens of the United States to free trade with any country they want, unimpeded. Now, I maybe I'm getting too radical, but it's the only way we can get out of this. Other than that, we're going to have these constant 9/11s and, baseball parks being blown up and whatever, and you cannot stop that. But I don't think they care because they're making so much money, they're not near the baseball park. That's your problem.
Exactly. And I think that you've hit on the nail on the head, because the answers are not as complex as we like to pretend sometimes they are. Politicians, their trade is to make these problems seem so complex that they're unsolvable, and therefore when they don't get solved, you kind of shrug and say, sure, it's just too complicated. No one's ever going to solve them. It's not that complicated. If you're tired of endless war, stop wars. If America's infrastructure is crumbling and we have the riches that we do as a nation, spend it on the infrastructure,
right,
not on something else.
Right.
If the Saudis are the ones who are funding Sunni terrorism around the world, which they are, then stop being nice to the Saudis.
Yeah.
The answers are not complex at all. We're just made to believe they're complex so that when things don't change, when the status quo is repeated for 70 years ongoing, then we kind of say, well, it is complicated, there's nothing we can do. Periodically, then, the politicians find it helpful to kind of stir us up against one another and create the impression that, well, Trump is uniquely bad. Look, I'm no supporter of Donald Trump. I didn't vote for either him or Hillary Clinton. The idea would be that the impression is created, well, that something radically different would be going on in Washington if Hillary Clinton was in charge. And the answer, of course, is no, it wouldn't. Mm-hmm. It would probably be dressed up a lot prettier, it would look a lot nicer, it would sound a lot better. I doubt that Hillary would put herself on TV saying the kind of dumbassery things that seem to come out of Trump's mouth. But other than kind of a nicer presentation, it's basically the same dog, different bark. And until and unless Americans understand that, nothing's going to change. This election cycle was the ripest in history, in modern history, for a viable third party.
Right.
And it is shameful, really, that no third party candidate was able to stand up strongly and make the call and say, look, you're faced with two people in the mainstream that you don't like. Don't decide that you have to pick the lesser of two evils. Let's pick something positive. Let's pick someone who is willing to tackle some of these problems and say, look, not everything can be fixed, but some things can. And let's pick a couple of those problems and go to work on them. And if we lick one of them, let's move on to the next one.
Yeah.
But unless and until the people rise up politically and say, this is what we want from a government, then the government is not going to give it to us. Trust me, they're not going to hand this
right.
over without a fight.
What bothers me is, after we directly or indirectly or participate in some way in the devastation of a particular country or a city in a particular country far, far away, then we say, well, we're going to, because we care, we send them food and water and things like that, and we make it seem like we're such nice guys. I mean, we created or helped create the devastation, and then we supply them some food and say, oh, see, the United States, we care. We really care about the people. We just want to kill the bad guys. And everything we do is so disingenuous. When I was with this radio station, I do this as a hobby, by the way. I have businesses and stuff like that, and I just do this because if I don't, I think I'll explode. And I've been doing it now for about 15, 20 years. And I used to be with a big station here, and I used to have, whenever I had congressmen, they were nasty. Oh boy, were they nasty. They could not be nice to me because I would ask them pointed questions, and they didn't have an answer for me. They would just get nasty, and they wouldn't give me the mic back. Anyway, that's another side story. But I don't see Trump making America great again, I was under the impression, falsely, naively, that he was going to come in and say, Department of Defense, we don't need a Department of Defense. We have generals to take care of that. Department of Education, that's the parents' responsibility, not the state, and go on, and not have a cabinet the way he has it, And I was totally disillusioned with everything he did. But, of course, I have friends that, would choke me for saying that, and I'm sure they're listening in. I'm going to get hell from them later on today. But, they're still latching on to this, well, he's going to make America great again. But they don't want to think about it. They don't want to discuss it. They just want to say it. And I'm disillusioned that all the things he said, he tweeted about Syria, how horrible it was that we were in Syria. We have no right being there. We should stop bombing them, leave the people alone, and free trade with them. Then Bingo gets in office and he does the exact same thing that his predecessor did.
And the result of all this, I'm afraid, is a growing cynicism among the people who are young voters. So many of them face these presidential elections for the very first time. Obama was in office 8 years. The people who were voting in their first presidential election really had limited to no adult experience with a different president. It was Obama all their basically political lives. And they come into an election as nasty as this one, where the wool was pulled over our eyes, where people were fooled, and they come out of it cynical. They come out of it with a lack of interest in participating in the process, and that just creates a snowball effect that I'm afraid sets up the inevitable re-election of Donald Trump, or the ascendancy of whoever the Democrats decide to run against him in 2020, and again eliminates the possibility of real change. We had a chance this time, and we didn't take advantage of it, and it leaves me a little more cynical than is healthy at my age, but particularly a little more frightened about the cynicism I see among young people who have a lot more ahead of them. It's the same as the soldiers in the book that I wrote, Hooper's War. They're making decisions at a young age that they don't quite understand they're going to carry the burden of for the next 70 years of their lives.
Well, they have to be brainwashed in a certain way. And we say brainwashing, we think of China and people, Chinese putting people in a room and repeating the same thing 1,000 times until they believe it. No, but people are brainwashed because our entire education system glosses over all the nasty parts of history and the true parts of history, and they reinvent history to make people believe that what we are doing is right. In my family, when I was a little kid, I had an uncle. He was old when I was a little kid, and he was my father's older brother, and he belonged to this organization. It started, I forgot the name of it. It started with an M, and I said, "Oh, but they sort of took care of people. You understand what I mean?" But there was at least, and I know this is going to sound horrible. This is going to sound inhumane and all that stuff. But at least they had a code of conduct. I mean, you knew what they were doing. They knew what they were doing was wrong, but they did it in a manner that I think was a lot more humane than what our government does, because at least they didn't lie. If he came up to you, he said, I'm sorry, this is the way it's got to be, you were gone, and they carried you out. And now I was never involved. My father was never involved. That was one of the what they call the black sheep of the family type thing, But I think they had a higher level of principle than our politicians had.
The idea would be that if your goal is simply to amass power and money, and you're not particularly concerned about whether you get that from stealing candy from babies or making honest deals or everything in between, then politics may be your field.
Yeah.
The decisions, it's all about these decisions and these choices. And I think that's what I've wanted to do with the writing that I do, both in this book, and I have a blog called WeMeantWell.com, and I'm on Twitter under the same name, We Meant Well, is to keep calling attention to these things in hopes that maybe, you know, if I stand on the roof and shout long enough and loud enough, one person might hear. And if that person hears, then, well, maybe he or she will pass it on to the next one. You're in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and that's Woody Guthrie's home. And I'm a big fan of Woody Guthrie. And Woody Guthrie, the folk singer, when he was singing during the Depression and during that period of time, the Dust Bowl years, that was a lot of what he wanted to do. He wanted to say, look, I can't talk to 100 people at one time effectively. They don't listen. But I'll try talking to 2 or 3 of them, and if I can reach those 2 or 3, then maybe they'll turn around and talk to the guys behind them, and so forth. And so I applaud what you're doing in this type of format, and I appreciate the chance to come on here and share your platform with you. And if both of us shout, maybe 2 or 3 people will listen, and they'll turn around and talk to those 2 or 3 people behind them. And we got a couple of years till the next election. Let's give it one more try, Joe.
Well, I want to thank you so much for writing this book. I think it's a book that everyone should read, but they shouldn't read it as a novel. They should think when they're reading it, and they will come to similar conclusions that I have. And I think this is going to be a real game changer for everyone. And I want to thank you so much. And thank you so much. And I'm just absolutely pleased for you to be in our program. And I do hope that you will accept our invitation to return at a later date.
Absolutely, Joe. I'm be happy to come on back. And thank you very much. My book's called Hooper's War. It's on Amazon, among other places. Please, if you have a moment, take a look at it, see if it's of interest. And hopefully some point in the future I'll come back and we'll talk to some listeners who have read it and see what they think of it.
That's great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Joe.
Folks, this is the end of today's program. We'd like to thank our sponsors for the financial support, and we'd like to thank you for listening in. You can further the cause of liberty by recommending this program to your friends, and let us hear from you. Our email address is comments@libertytalkradio.com. Remember, as my wife would say, you're either allowing your liberties to be taken away or you're striving to protect them. Unfortunately, there is no middle ground. Until next time, this is Joe Cristiano. You've been listening to Liberty Talk Radio. Stay well. Stay tuned.